Torah Life Ministries come out of the world. Messiah people seek the truth.
All right, everybody, it's Paul Neeson with Torah Life Ministries. We got a great guest, second time on the show, Daniel Bakken. He's talking about a very important topic we can all benefit from learning more about, and here it is now. Tell us what you're going to be talking about today, Daniel.
I'll talk for a few minutes about what I call the coming polarization.
Okay, so take it away.
Okay, polarization means a dividing into two opposite groups, and what I see coming in the Bible-believing Christian world is a polarization, and I say that because I see the Christian faith morphing into two distinct forms that are antithetical to one another. One form that I see the Christian faith morphing into is what is commonly called the Messianic movement, which we are a part of. And the Messianic movement is about getting back to the Hebrew roots of the faith, retrieving, recovering, and reclaiming the commandments of the Torah that the church neglected. Things like Sabbath, festivals, dietary laws, things like that. Not because these are the most important of all the commandments, but because these are among the most neglected of God's commandments. So that is one faith that one form that the Christian faith is morphing into. The other form that the Christian faith is morphing into is the exact opposite. Instead of retrieving and reclaiming commandments of God, it's wanting to throw away even more of God's commandments. And by that I mean commandments not just from the Old Testament Scriptures, but from the New Testament Scriptures as well. There are, unfortunately, evangelical, Bible-believing Christian leaders who are wanting to question things like homosexuality. Should we still consider it a sin in 21st century America? They basically take what's called the Wikipedia approach. If you're familiar with Wikipedia, it's an online encyclopedia. Anybody can go on there and, add information, delete information, change information, contribute. And they view the inspiration of the Bible that way. They don't outright deny the inspiration of the Bible, but they describe it this way. Like one writer says this: in our Bible, God did what God has always done. He spoke in Moses' day in Moses' ways, in Micah's day in Micah's ways, in Jesus' days in Jesus' ways. Which meant when Paul came around, Paul got to speak in Paul's ways for Paul's days, and when John put quill to parchment, he was freed up to speak in John's ways for John's days. And the same author of this book that this quote's from, he discusses the popular "that was then, but this is now" approach. And according to this view, it's not a matter of simply reading the Scriptures and following the instructions God gives us. Rather, they tell us we are supposed to discern which instructions in the Bible, which instructions are inspired for us in our generation, in our culture. And this writer says the church of every age is summoned by God to the Bible to listen so we can discern a pattern for living the gospel that is appropriate for our age. Now, the danger to this approach is this: if you take this approach, you can dismiss any biblical commandment you want by simply saying it doesn't work in our culture. For example, homosexuality. Some people are saying, look, to say that this sin is an abomination, it just doesn't work in 21st century America. It actually hinders the gospel because you can't realistically expect homosexuals to stop their behavior. I'm not picking on homosexuals. There are a lot of other abominations in the church I could mention. I just mentioned this one because this is probably one of the hottest topics right now in the church. This debate on whether or not homosexuality should still be considered sinful in 21st century America. See, basically what this amounts to is an effort by church leaders to redefine sin, to redefine what constitutes sin. Now, the longest held Christian definition of sin is in the Bible in 1 John 3:4. It says, sin is the transgression of the law. There's your simple, plain definition of what is considered sinful. To transgress means to step over the line. God has drawn the boundaries. He's drawn the lines. He said, you don't step over this line. If you step over this line, you transgress that, you've committed sin. And so church leaders are wanting to redefine sin and basically define it themselves. They say that we need to take a different approach, engage our culture, make the biblical faith relevant to people who live in postmodern times. And yes, we need to engage our culture. There's nothing wrong with taking a different approach for evangelism and so forth. But we cannot lower the standard of the Scriptures, because you're just lowering the bar. I remember, 30-some years ago, I heard somebody say something that always stuck with me. And I've lived to witness this coming true. They said something like this. They said, talking about moral standards, they said, you tell me what the world, the unbelieving world, tolerates and accepts today, and I'll tell you what the church will tolerate and accept 15 or 20 years from now. And that's come true because, see, the church always has a higher standard. The world has a certain standard, of morality, up, let's say this high. And the church has a higher moral standard than the unbelieving world. But as the unbelieving world lowers its moral standard a notch at a time, the church does the same thing. And all we're doing is maintaining distance. And because, we think that because we have a higher moral standard than the unbelieving world, we think that we're holding to God's moral standard. But 15 or 20 years from now, we'll be down to where the world is. And we need to maintain the standard that God holds in the Scriptures. And so, this is my concern, is this redefining of sin. But the polarization is happening because, in contrast to the Christian leaders who are advocating abandoning more commandments, lowering the bar in order to get more people into their megachurches, on the other hand, we have the Messianic movement that's about reclaiming, restoring, retrieving, and learning to do these neglected commandments of the Torah. And the Messianic movement of the past 20 years, since I started walking this way in the late 1980s, I've seen the Messianic movement grow in influence as well as in numbers. Back in the late 1980s, this was over 20 years ago when I first started keeping the Sabbath and the festivals, quit eating swine's flesh, started wearing tzitzit, convinced my wife to put a head covering on and start wearing dresses instead of pants. And, back then in the late 1980s, it was easy for people to dismiss me as an oddball. It's easy if you've just got one family or even a small congregation of a few families living this way. You can just say, well, they're just oddballs. You can dismiss them as fringe lunatics. But the Messianic movement is growing in influence. It's going, it's not gone mainstream yet, I don't think, but it is going mainstream. It is becoming more accepted to people, it's becoming more opposed by some people, but there are more and more people who are looking into this and questioning things. I believe that there are Christians in seminaries, seminary students who are asking their professors questions. I believe that there are people in the pews asking their pastors questions when they get exposed to some Messianic teaching, and they ask their pastors or their seminary professors, why don't we keep Seventh-day Sabbath instead of going to church on Sunday? Why don't we celebrate Passover and these other festivals? And I think that these honest questions are forcing evangelical church leaders to come up with some kind of answer. Because you either have to say, well, you know what? Those people are right. We should start doing that way, and we're going to start doing things that way. You either have to do that, or you have to oppose it. And, I believe that there are certain times in history where, where God simply draws the proverbial line in the sand and tells people, choose which side you're on. Moses did it. Remember, he said, who is on Yahweh's side? Who? Let him come unto me. Joshua did it. Choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers. As for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. Elijah did it at Carmel. He said, how long do you halt between two opinions? If Yahweh, if Baal be God, serve him. If Yahweh be God, serve him. And Yeshua said that, don't think not that I've come to send peace on the earth, but a sword that I'm going to divide. And so I believe that there is a coming polarization that, right now people can kind of waffle in between, but I believe that the time is going to come, hopefully soon, when it will become more clear to more Christians that, look, you need to, either, if you think that we're a heresy from hell, say so. Preach against us. Preach against our message. And if not, if we're right, then come on board and join with us and walk in this joyful way of rediscovering and recovering.
All right, Daniel, how can people get this message online? or how could they get it sent to them now?
Well, actually, this message that I've just kind of summarized real briefly, I've got it available on a CD if you want to write to me. I've also got it in written form in this November-December issue of Gates of Eden. I've got it in written form, so you can either call me, write me, email.
What's the website, how they get in touch with you?
gatesofeden.org.
Wonderful.
And my phone number's on there if you prefer to use a phone, 309-699-0199.
All right, and it's not just this great message, but you got other great messages there. I recommend everyone get it. All right, everybody, there it was, Daniel Bakken. It's a great message. It's so true. It's so important. Separating the clean from the unclean. And Daniel brought it to you today, and check it out. Get that article, get that CD. Go to his website. There's other great articles on there. gatesofeden.org. All right, everybody, it's Paul Neitz with Torah Life Ministries. Have a great day.
Seek the truth, avoid the evil, learn Yahweh's way.